Under the dim lights of a forgotten harbor, a powerful Arab billionaire grips a pair of steel scissors, the blade glinting in the night. Jack, a U.S. veteran, hangs bound and gagged from the rail of an old cargo ship, swaying helplessly above the black waves below. But nearby, locked inside a steel crate, waits Rex, a loyal K9 who had once served with honor, a dog whose devotion had carried him through fire, battle, and loss. One cut is all it would take to end Jack's life, yet destiny is about to be rewritten by the courage of a faithful companion. Before we begin, tell us where in the world you are watching from and how this moment makes you feel. If you believe that stories of loyalty, sacrifice, and silent heroes still matter, stay with us. Wishing you a meaningful day filled with hope and strength as we uncover this extraordinary tale together. The night had settled heavily over the city, pressing down with the damp weight of salt air and shadows. Out beyond the crowded streets and the glow of commerce, there lay a forgotten stretch of harbor where half-sunken piers jutted like crooked fingers into the tide and abandoned warehouses slumped against each other in the dark. This was no place of laughter or trade, only rust and whispers, a corner chosen precisely because no one came here willingly. It was to this place that Jack Carter had been brought, the man who had once stood tall in uniform, a veteran of 42 years with broad shoulders and steady eyes, a figure of endurance worn by time and scars, now reduced to silence by rope and gag. Jack had not expected his life to twist this way. Working for a mid-sized transport company had seemed like stability after the battlefield, a way to keep food on the table and to walk quietly with his loyal companion Rex at his side. But fate had a strange way of unfolding. In piles of documents and digital trails that most would skim past, Jack had spotted what others had missed or perhaps dared not to see. Contracts that shifted numbers in circles, money that vanished into shell names, signatures that did not match, and payments that appeared twice but never landed where they should. At first he thought it was carelessness, but the deeper he went, the clearer it became. A scheme engineered by hands too wealthy, too arrogant to believe they could be touched. The name that surfaced again and again was Omar al-Fahid, a billionaire from the Gulf, mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair combed immaculately back, a lean frame draped always in suits tailored with quiet cruelty. Omar was a man whose fortune had built towers in his homeland and bought influence across continents. His features were sharp, cheekbones cut high, eyes the color of polished coal, always assessing, always calculating. To the public he was a philanthropist, a benefactor who attended galas with an elegant smile. To those who worked beneath him, he was iron-cloaked in silk, and Jack had stumbled straight into the heart of Omar's deception. The discovery should have gone to the authorities, should have been handled by auditors and courts, but Jack underestimated how quickly Omar's reach could stretch. The moment Jack confided his intention to report the fraud, a whisper must have traveled. Men came for him, silent, efficient, their faces shadowed beneath caps and their hands practiced at violence. They dragged him from the modest office where he had worked late, binding his wrists with practiced knots, gagging him before neighbors could raise questions. His resistance was brief, more instinct than hope, the swing of a man who had fought before but knew when odds were insurmountable. By the time the black van rolled to a halt, the stench of salt and rust announced their destination. Jack was hauled onto the deck of an old cargo ship, its hull scarred with years of neglect, its rails streaked with flaking paint, and the deck groaning under weight long forgotten by commerce. Dim lanterns swung in the breeze, casting light that seemed more shadow than flame. The harbor was still, save for the slap of waves against corroded steel. Here, no witnesses lingered, no patrols came by. It was the perfect theater for a disappearance. Rex had been forced along too. A German shepherd, 6 years old by the vet's last count, with a broad chest and a saddle of black fur that faded into tan legs, he carried himself with the proud discipline of training that had once marked him a K9. His eyes were amber, intelligent, and restless, his ears always alert. To Jack, he was more than a companion. He was family, one who had shared both quiet mornings and restless nights haunted by memories. But tonight Rex was helpless, locked inside a steel crate, claws scraping against the bars, teeth gnashing with the frustration of captivity. His bark tore through the stillness, echoing across the empty dock, a sound of fury and fear. On deck, Jack was dragged to the rail. His wrists were lashed tight behind him, his chest bound in coils of rough rope that cut into skin, his mouth sealed with tape that tasted of rust and glue. He fought to keep his balance as rough hands forced him forward, his boots scraping against the corroded metal until the edge yawned beneath him. They tied an additional rope around his torso, not to save him, but to suspend him for Omar's cruel satisfaction. Dangling above the black water, Jack swayed in the salt wind, the sea below waiting like a grave. His breath came in sharp bursts through his nose, chest heaving against the bindings. Omar emerged from the shadows then, stepping onto the deck with a presence that silenced even the men who had dragged Jack here. He wore a charcoal gray suit despite the damp, the fabric pressed into razor lines, shoes polished to gleam even in the dim light. In his hand he held no weapon, only the authority that money and fear bestowed. His expression was composed, lips curved faintly as though this were a negotiation rather than an execution. He studied Jack like a failed investment, something that had outlived its usefulness. The billionaire's voice was low, accented, smooth as glass, but beneath it lay an edge sharper than any blade. "You looked too closely," Omar said, almost conversationally, as though addressing a colleague over dinner. "Numbers are not your battlefield, veteran. Loyalty is. You gave yours to a company that no longer exists." His gaze shifted briefly toward the crate where Rex rattled and barked, then back to Jack. "And even the most loyal companion cannot save you now." His words hung in the air, cruel in their calmness. Jack's eyes burned with defiance, but bound as he was, the defiance was all he had left. He twisted slightly, the muscles in his arms straining against the rope, but Omar's men only tightened their grip. The deck creaked under the weight of silence, broken only by Rex's desperate howls and the soft hiss of waves slapping the hull. Jack's mind raced, not with panic but with fragments, the forged contracts, the false signatures, the names of shell companies, the web that tied them all back to Omar. He had wanted to protect the innocent, to shine a light where darkness profited, but now he stood at the edge of that darkness himself. His throat ached behind the gag as he tried to force air past the taste of glue, every breath a reminder of how quickly life could be stolen. Suspended above the sea, Jack Carter was no longer the man who uncovered fraud, no longer the veteran who once marched with honor. He was simply a target, a problem to be erased. Yet even as Omar's cold gaze lingered, even as the ropes cut deeper into his flesh, Jack's eyes flicked once more toward the crate where Rex fought against confinement. And in that flicker there was still something left. The unspoken bond between man and dog, a promise of loyalty not so easily severed, even at the edge of despair. The harbor was still cloaked in silence, broken only by the rattle of chains against metal and the restless bark of a dog whose loyalty burned hotter than fear. Jack swayed helplessly above the black water, bound and gagged, his boots scraping against the corroded rail, the salty wind stinging his skin. The men who had dragged him here stood a few paces back, eyes lowered, waiting for the command of the only man who mattered. Omar al-Fahid stepped forward from the shadows, his expression calm, his every movement deliberate, as though this night was not a crime but the signing of a contract. Omar al-Fahid stepped forward from the shadows, mid-50s, tall and wiry, his face lined not by time but by ambition. He wore a pristine white thobe that shimmered faintly under the swaying lantern, the fabric whispering with each movement of the sea breeze. Draped across his head and shoulders was a red and white keffiyeh, its folds set with deliberate precision, the cloth framing his sharp features and cold, dark eyes that never softened. Polished black shoes struck the rusted steel with each step, measured and unhurried. In his hand gleamed a pair of heavy scissors, the blades catching the light like fangs, his calm expression turning the act of murder into a ritual of control. He did not raise his voice, for he had long since learned that true authority needed no volume. Standing just behind him was a younger man, no more than 30, his assistant and shadow, dressed in black trousers and a simple dark jacket, his eyes darting nervously between his master and the bound figure swaying at the rail. The assistant's jaw was tight, his lips pressed into a thin line, betraying the unease of someone who had never grown used to blood, even when it was not his own. Yet Omar paid him no mind, as though the man's existence was as trivial as the gulls circling overhead. Tonight, there would be no delegation. The billionaire himself intended to deliver the final act. Jack's chest rose and fell in sharp bursts, his lungs straining against the gag as he tried to suck in air heavy with salt. His body swung in the wind, rope biting deeper into his arms and shoulders, pain flaring with each shift. He looked up, meeting Omar's gaze, and even bound as he was, there was defiance in his eyes. It was the kind of defiance Omar despised most, the refusal to break even at the brink of death. Omar's lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile, not of amusement, but of satisfaction that soon resistance would be drowned beneath the waves. The assistant took a small step forward, perhaps to offer the scissors, perhaps to whisper that the tide was rising, but Omar raised one hand in dismissal. He wanted no interference. He wanted to be the one to sever the thread himself. Slowly, almost ceremonially, he leaned in and placed the blades against the taut rope that held Jack suspended. The metal bit lightly into the fibers, the sound sharp in the night air, and for a moment the harbor itself seemed to hold its breath. Omar's cold dark eyes never left Jack's face, as if to ensure that the veteran's final memory would be the image of his executioner. Then, with a decisive snap of his wrist, the rope gave way. Jack plunged downward, his body twisting as the air rushed past him, the black sea opening wide below. The sound of the splash was heavy and final, a single brutal note swallowed quickly by the waves. The men on deck shifted uneasily, some glancing at each other, as though realizing that even loyalty to power left a bitter aftertaste when faced with such cruelty. Omar, however, remained composed, slipping the scissors back into his jacket pocket as though the act had been nothing more than trimming paper. From the steel crate near the rail came an explosion of sound. Rex, the 6-year-old German shepherd, had been thrashing against confinement since the moment Jack was dragged to the edge. But now desperation lent him strength that no bars could contain. With a savage growl and a final heave, he forced the latch open, his body slamming against the door until it burst free. His amber eyes caught the lantern light, blazing with fury, his powerful frame surging across the deck in a blur of tan and black. Without hesitation, without fear, Rex launched himself off the rail, leaping into the void where Jack had vanished. The water swallowed him with a violent splash, but within seconds his head broke the surface, ears slicked back, jaws snapping for air. The current was strong, the tide pulling outward toward the open sea, but Rex's muscles worked like pistons, each stroke carrying him closer to the spot where Jack's body had disappeared. His bark rang out between gulps of water, sharp and determined, carrying across the harbor like a war cry. For Rex, this was not instinct alone. It was loyalty forged through years of companionship, through battles fought side by side, through nights when only a dog's steady breath kept the darkness at bay. On the deck above, Omar watched, his brows knitting faintly, the first crack in his composure. He had expected silence, an end, not resistance born of fur and fangs. His assistant shifted again, uneasy, whispering that the dog would drown. But Omar said nothing, only tightened his jaw, unwilling to admit that he had underestimated the bond between a man and his companion. Below, the water churned, bucking slapping hard against the hull, and from the depths came a muffled struggle. Jack fighting against the sea, Rex fighting against fate itself. Every second felt endless, the night thick with tension. The lantern swayed, casting jagged shadows across Omar's face, while Rex's growls echoed from below. The men who had followed orders now stood in silence, some looking toward the water, others toward their master, as though uncertain whether what they witnessed was defiance or destiny. Yet for Jack Carter, there was no choice left. His life dangled between the merciless tide and the loyalty of a dog who refused to let go. And in that dark harbor, beneath a sky heavy with storm, the battle for survival had begun. The sea was a living beast, black and restless beneath the corroded hull of the cargo ship, swallowing sound and light with equal hunger. Jack plunged into its depths moments earlier, and now he drifted near the surface, his body limp, wrists bound tightly behind his back, the gag choking every desperate attempt at breath. His consciousness slipped like sand through grasping fingers, and his eyes fluttered half shut, dulled by exhaustion and salt. Above him, Rex fought with the single-minded ferocity of a soldier who had never learned the meaning of surrender. His muscular body slamming against the current, jaws clenched into the torn fabric of Jack's shirt as he held his master's head above water. Each bark that tore from his throat was half a plea, half a command, a demand that the night bear witness to loyalty that would not break. But the harbor was not empty. On the far side, half hidden in the shadows of stacked containers, a man stood frozen, his hands raw from hours of labor, the stink of sweat and salt still clinging to him. Caleb Turner was 24, tall and wiry from long days hauling crates, his shoulders hardened by toil, but his heart still tender in ways he often hid. His face, sunburned from years under an unforgiving sky, was now a mask of disbelief as he watched a dog fighting the sea for the life of a man. His clothes were plain faded jeans rolled at the cuffs, a cotton shirt sticking to his chest with damp, and boots that had long since lost their polish. In his eyes flickered a storm of fear and conscience, warring against each other with every splash that echoed across the night. At first, Caleb stepped back, pressing himself against the cold metal of the container wall, his breath sharp and uneven. He had grown up near this harbor, had heard whispers about powerful men who made trouble vanish into the tide, and he knew better than most the cost of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. His father had once warned him, "Stay out of rich men's storms, they sink ships that aren't even theirs." And yet, as his pulse thundered in his ears, his gaze locked on Rex, the shepherd straining with every muscle, refusing to let the veteran disappear. Something cracked inside Caleb then. Not reason, not calculation, but the raw surge of humanity that could not bear to watch loyalty die unanswered. With a sharp exhale, he kicked off his boots, letting them clatter against the dock, and leapt into the water. The cold shocked his skin, burning his lungs as he dove beneath the surface before surging upward again, arms flailing until he found rhythm. Caleb was no trained swimmer, no hero by design, but desperation lent him strokes faster than thought. He cut through the waves toward the flailing pair, salt water stinging his eyes, the taste of iron thick in his mouth. His mind screamed of danger, of drowning, of the unseen current that could drag him down, but his heart drove him forward, each kick a defiance of fear. Rex caught sight of him between barks, amber eyes narrowing, not in distrust but in recognition of help. The dog shifted, his grip on Jack firm, his body pivoting just enough to allow Caleb to slide in beside them. "Hold him up," Caleb gasped, his arms wrapping around Jack's chest from behind, straining against the dead weight. Together, man and dog became a desperate lifeline, muscles screaming as they kept Jack's head tilted toward the air, every breath he stole rattling like a broken engine. For the first time, Rex's bark broke into a whine, not of weakness, but of shared effort, as though acknowledging the stranger as a comrade in this impossible fight. The cries reached farther than the dock. From the narrow lanes near the warehouses, voices stirred. A pair of fishermen, gray-haired and thick with calluses, stumbled from their shack at the sound, lanterns bobbing in their hands. A woman in her 40s, shawl wrapped tightly against the chill, clutched her son's wrist as they ran toward the commotion, the boy wide-eyed with fear and wonder. Soon others followed, dockhands, night wanderers, a couple of sailors lingering over their cigarettes, all drawn by the piercing chorus of splashing and barking. When they reached the edge and saw the figures struggling against the waves, panic turned into action. "Ropes!" someone shouted, and within moments a coil was flung across the water, its end smacking against the surface just out of reach. Caleb twisted, teeth gritted, and lunged his free hand toward it, fingers brushing the wet fibers before slipping away. "Again!" cried the woman with the shawl, and another line sailed overhead, this time landing closer. Rex, sensing the shift, snapped his jaws at the rope, clamping down tight even as his muscles trembled with exhaustion. Caleb steadied his grip on Jack, shouting hoarsely for the people above to pull. Together, human hands and canine strength forged a chain between the drowning man and the shore. The struggle felt endless, every tug against the rope dragging them inches closer to salvation, every surge of the current threatening to rip them apart. Jack's body jerked once, his chest convulsing as brine filled his lungs, but Rex and Caleb held fast, their combined strength refusing to yield. On the dock, the fisherman leaned back, sinews straining, while the boy cheered with a voice that cut through the chaos. Slowly, agonizingly, the figures rose from the water's grip, drawn toward the jagged stones at the harbor's edge. Caleb's arms burned, his vision blurred, but he clung tighter, knowing that letting go was not an option. Finally, with a heave that tore grunts from every throat on the dock, they hauled Jack onto the slick planks. He lay sprawled on the boards, chest heaving shallowly, skin pale as moonlight. Caleb collapsed beside him, coughing salt water, his body trembling from the cold. Rex staggered onto the wood, his fur plastered flat, his amber eyes scanning Jack's face with frantic urgency. The shepherd nudged his master's shoulder once, twice, then barked again, a desperate sound that rang of hope refusing to die. Around them, villagers pressed in, some patting Jack's back, others shouting for blankets, for someone to fetch a doctor. For a moment, all was chaos, voices, lanterns, the hiss of the waves against the pilings. But within it lay something undeniable. The bond of strangers united by compassion. A dog whose loyalty never wavered, and a dock worker who found courage where he least expected it. Jack coughed once, rivering seawater onto the planks, his body jolting before collapsing again into fragile breaths. Caleb looked down at him, chest still heaving, and whispered almost to himself, "He's alive." By God, he's alive. Rex pressed closer, tail thumping weakly against the wood, his head lowering to rest protectively across Jack's chest. And so, under the dim lanterns of the forgotten harbor, a miracle had been pulled from the teeth of the sea. Jack Carter still breathed, saved by the unyielding devotion of a German shepherd, the reluctant bravery of a dock worker, and the timely aid of ordinary townsfolk who refused to look away. For that night, against the designs of power and cruelty, humanity prevailed in its simplest, fiercest form, the refusal to abandon another soul to the dark. The dock was heavy with silence after the frantic struggle, the air thick with the mingled scents of salt water, wet rope, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Lanterns flickered along the worn planks, their glow casting trembling halos across faces that had just borne witness to a miracle. Jack Carter lay sprawled on the rough boards, his chest heaving shallowly, every breath sounding like it might be his last. His soaked clothes clung to his frame, his lips blue from the cold, while his eyes flickered open and shut as if his spirit fought to remain tethered to the world. Beside him, Rex pressed close, fur dripping and plastered against his ribs, amber eyes locked on his master with a devotion that would not waver. Jack coughed violently, his body convulsing as brine spilled from his mouth, his hands still bound though slackened by the water's grip. Rough palms reached down. Caleb Turner, still gasping from his own plunge into the sea, knelt beside him, fingers fumbling at the knots with urgency born from fear. "Stay with us," Caleb whispered, his sunburnt face pale in the lantern light. The villagers gathered in a circle, their breaths caught in their throats, some clutching blankets, others wringing hands, all watching as the line between life and death played out at their feet. Rex barked once, sharp and commanding, as though urging them all to act faster. At last the ropes gave way, leaving Jack's wrists raw and bruised, his arms falling limply to the dock. His lips parted, releasing a hoarse sound that wavered between a groan and a word. Caleb leaned closer, straining to catch the fragments. Through the rasp of seawater and the trembling stutter of failing lungs, Jack forced syllables into the night. A number, another, then a name strange, foreign, but laced with weight. The assistant fisherman, a burly man with a gray beard, furrowed his brow as he repeated it aloud. A company name whispered like a secret, a shell that meant nothing to ordinary folk, but everything to a man who had seen the rot beneath its polished facade. The villagers exchanged glances, confusion and suspicion threading through their expressions. Caleb, though uneducated in matters of finance, felt the weight of those words settle into his gut like a stone. He placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, steadying him as the veteran coughed again, his voice collapsing into silence. "He's holding on to something," Caleb muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, and already he knew this was no accident, no drunken slip into the harbor, but something darker, orchestrated by hands that had never known labor. The woman in the shawl pressed a damp cloth against Jack's forehead, whispering prayers as if they might stitch his fractured breaths together. Minutes bled into one another, but slowly color began to return to Jack's cheeks, faint but undeniable, as though Rex's presence anchored him back to life. The shepherd never strayed, his muzzle nudging Jack's hand until at last the fingers twitched in acknowledgement. When Jack's eyes finally opened wide enough to meet the circle of faces above him, He saw not fear, but expectation, people waiting for truth. With a groan, he propped himself against Caleb's arm, his body trembling, his voice ragged but steadier now. He spoke haltingly, recounting what he had discovered: forged contracts, falsified ledgers, streams of money vanishing into hollow companies that existed only on paper, all tied to a name they now knew: Omar al-Fahid. The crowd listened in weighted silence, broken only by the crack of waves against the pilings and Rex's low, restless growl. Caleb clenched his jaw, his rough features hardening as the puzzle fit together. "That wasn't just murder," he said bitterly. "That was silencing." Around him, heads nodded, eyes narrowing as the villagers began to understand the scale of what they had stumbled into. One of the fishermen spat on the boards, muttering about men who thought themselves untouchable, while the boy beside his mother clutched her arm tighter, sensing the danger wrapped inside these revelations. Jack's hand trembled as he reached for Caleb's sleeve. This has to be reported," he rasped, voice cracking. "Not rumors, not whispers. Evidence." Caleb met his gaze and saw not just a drowning man, but a soldier's resolve burning beneath the exhaustion. For the first time, Caleb understood that the numbers Jack had forced through his broken breath were not accidents of delirium, but keys, fragments of a truth bigger than the sea that had nearly claimed him. The dockworker nodded slowly, shoulders straightening as he turned to the others. "He's right. We can't keep this in the dark. It needs the law." Rex barked again, startling the boy, but drawing quiet murmurs of agreement from the crowd. The villagers, once uncertain, now shifted into motion. One woman fetched blankets from her home nearby, draping them over Jack's shivering form. A sailor ran for a lantern to signal down the shoreline, hoping to draw attention from the nearest patrol. And Caleb, steadying Jack with one arm, looked to the fisherman with the gray beard. "The Coast Guard," he said firmly. "We'll give our names. We'll stand with him." The older man nodded, a grim set to his jaw, the kind born of years spent watching tides carry away too many unspoken truths. As Jack regained more strength, his voice steadied enough to recount the sequence in greater detail. He told them of ledgers hidden in shipping manifests, of cargo that never arrived but was always accounted for, of signatures that were nothing but inked lies. Each word carved deeper into the night, laying bare the kind of corruption that preyed on silence. The villagers listened, their faces marked with disbelief and anger, and Caleb felt the lines of his life bending, no longer just a dock worker, but a witness. He tightened his grip on Jack's shoulder, steadying him not only against collapse, but against despair. The lantern light trembled against the waves as the group gathered closer, voices hushed but resolute. They knew danger had brushed their harbor that night, that what they had pulled from the water was more than a man. It was a truth that demanded defense. And so, as Rex lay pressed against Jack's side, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with his master's, the decision was made. Jack Carter, Caleb Turner, and the villagers of the forgotten dock would testify. The sea had tried to swallow the evidence, but instead, it had carried it into the open, delivered on the breath of a soldier who refused to die in silence. The harbor that had once echoed with desperate cries now stood quiet, its weathered planks carrying the faint scent of salt and lantern oil. Days had passed since that night when Jack Carter was pulled back from the jaws of the sea, and in those days the world beyond the forgotten dock had shifted. The Coast Guard had swarmed the case, investigators poring over ledgers, tracing signatures, and unraveling the web of deceit Jack had fought to expose. What had been fragments murmured through a fading breath became threads woven into a tapestry of truth that could no longer be denied. Omar al-Fahid, the man who once believed his wealth placed him above consequence, found the net of justice tightening with each sunrise. He had tried to flee, slipping quietly toward the airport under the cover of his entourage, his flowing white thobe and red and white keffiyeh marking his presence, polished black shoes carrying him forward as cases of wealth rolled at his side. But he had not expected the weight of testimony: Caleb Turner's quiet, steady words, the villagers' unwavering accounts, and Jack's clear memory of the numbers and names that unlocked the empire of fraud. At the terminal gates, uniformed officers intercepted him, the cold click of cuffs replacing the applause he had once believed eternal. His eyes, once lit with confidence, now burned with indignation as he was escorted away. News traveled quickly, weaving through ports and villages, carried by radios, papers, and the eager voices of those who had seen power humbled. For the people of the harbor, it was not just the fall of a billionaire, but proof that their courage, however ordinary it seemed, had mattered. Caleb became the subject of whispered respect. He was no longer only the wiry dock worker with calloused hands. He was the man who had leapt into black water because his conscience had not allowed him to stand still. The townsfolk gave him a name with pride, the hero of the empty dock. His cheeks flushed whenever he heard it, for Caleb had never thought of himself as more than a laborer, yet in his modest heart he carried the weight of that night as a private truth. Jack's recovery was slow but steady. In a small seaside clinic, attended by a nurse with gentle hands and a doctor whose years in service gave him patience, the veteran began to regain strength. His ribs still ached from the ropes, his lungs burned when he laughed, but his spirit no longer bent beneath exhaustion. Visitors came. Caleb, sometimes with bread tucked under his arm, the shawled woman who had prayed by the dock, fishermen bringing fish as if nourishment could stand in place of gratitude. Yet through it all, Rex never left his side. The German shepherd's amber eyes followed every movement, his broad chest rising and falling against the floorboards, his ears flicking at the slightest sound. To the nurses, he was a curiosity. To Jack, he was salvation made flesh. The authorities, hardened men in blue coats with notebooks always open, came often, their pens scratching furiously as Jack spoke. He described the false contracts, the shell companies, the patterns of betrayal hidden in plain sight. They listened, cross-checked, and nodded, each word strengthening the chain of evidence that would ensure Omar's fall was permanent. When Caleb and the villagers were called in, they stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices steady as they recounted what they had seen. The scissors glinting in the night, the rope snapping. The plunge, the dog, the rescue. Their testimony was not dressed in grandeur, but in the simple power of truth. And that truth carried more weight than any fortune. For Rex, the recognition came not in words but in actions. Children approached cautiously, laying small hands against his damp fur, whispering "hero" in tones of awe. Men who had once dismissed him as a stray now scratched his ears with respect, while women pressed food into Jack's hands for the dog first, the soldier second. And though Rex accepted it all, his gaze always returned to Jack, as if reminding them all that loyalty was never for applause but for love. The local paper ran his image on its front page, calling him the silent hero of the sea, a title that stirred something quiet in Jack's chest, for he knew it was true. When Jack finally walked again without staggering, supported only by Rex's patient presence at his side, he returned to the dock where it had all begun. The air was fresher that morning, the sea calmer, as though even the tide understood that justice had shifted the balance. Caleb stood waiting, his hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jacket, his expression torn between pride and humility. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered when Jack approached, but his voice carried warmth. Jack clasped his arm firmly, a soldier's gesture of respect, and for a moment words were unnecessary. The climax of it all came with the dawn. As the first rays of sunlight spilled across the horizon, painting the old cargo ship in streaks of gold and crimson, Jack knelt beside Rex. The shepherd's fur glowed in the light, damp but radiant, his breath steady after the long ordeal. Jack's fingers combed gently through the coarse hair, his voice breaking into a whisper meant for no one else. "You gave me another chance," he said, his eyes burning not with tears but with gratitude. "Another chance to fight for truth, to live, to stand." Rex's ears flicked at the sound, and he leaned into the touch, tail sweeping once against the boards in quiet agreement. Behind them, the villagers gathered, watching the scene fold with reverence. The boy tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing eagerly, while Caleb stood with his arms crossed, the faintest smile softening his rugged features. The sun rose higher, the sky brightening with promise, and the harbor that had been the stage of cruelty was now bathed in light. For those who had stood together, who had refused to look away, it was not just morning, it was the dawn of justice. And though scars would remain, though memories of the dark water would never leave, they knew that loyalty, courage, and truth had prevailed. The story closed not with shouts or triumph, but with the simple act of a man whispering to his dog, a dock worker standing taller than before, and a community bound forever by a night when silence was broken. Justice had found its way to the harbor, and with it, hope had returned. In the end, This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest heroes do not wear uniforms or speak with loud voices. They are the loyal companions who never leave our side, the ordinary people who step forward when silence would be easier, and the sacrifices made quietly in the shadows for the sake of others. Loyalty, compassion, and silent courage are gifts that can change the course of a life, and perhaps even the course of the world. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder of hope. Leave a comment with what you are thinking right now, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith and humanity. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, strength, and protection.